It's always a pleasure to be back with you. Last week you had Tom Widmer talk, for those of you who were here, about the Outreach Foundation and what the Outreach Foundation is doing in the Middle East in particular. Tonight we're going to do a continental shift and go to Africa. And I will talk a bit about what Outreach is doing and what I've been doing and continue to do in Africa. While that's booting up, there are some handouts at the back of various projects and programs that I'm particularly involved in East Africa. And one is my partnership update about the work that I do. Another one is called Rebuilding Hope in South Sudan. And we'll take a closer look at that during this. Here we go. Well, the title that I was given is the Modern Mission Field in East Africa. Can you all see that okay, or do we need to turn out some lights? It's okay? I'll try not to stand in your way over here. So I went to Africa in 1979. Some of you were around then. And it was after university and before doing any further graduate work, and I decided to take what was known now as a gap year and went as a volunteer in mission under the PCUS, the Southern Church at that time, had a one-year program for volunteers. And I'd never been out of the country before, didn't have a passport, had hardly been out of North Carolina before, and ended up in Congo, Zaire. But I spent that year there, and missions and world mission got into my blood, along with malaria and a few other things. And so I decided that this was certainly a calling that God was calling me to do the rest of my life. Came back and did some graduate work in public health. That's my field, and ended up marrying Nancy Miller. Her mom Holly's here, my mother-in-law, so I have to behave. But we went back out to Africa. Nancy had been born and raised, of course, in Africa, and we went back to Africa in 1985 after we were married here in Montreat. So Montreat really is a special place for us. Well, the Outreach Foundation has been in operation for 42 years and is working in 37 countries with partners, Presbyterian partners, primarily in evangelism, church development, leadership training, and compassionate ministries. Those are sort of the four areas that Outreach is working in. It's a small foundation, in total probably less than 20 people. Several of us are assigned to areas of the world, myself and Marilyn Boris and some others. And there's a small office in Franklin, Tennessee, which we kind of call headquarters, although people have been working virtually as everywhere. Well, I joined Outreach in 2017 after being a mission co-worker and working in World Mission in Louisville for a few years. Outreach was looking for somebody to be their Africa person and work with their African partners. And that included a number of countries in East and Southern Africa. These are the countries in East Africa. The primary countries are those three: Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Kenya. In addition to that, the small country of Rwanda that's almost too small to see. Those are where we have long-standing partnerships with the Presbyterian Church of South Sudan, the Ethiopian Evangelical Church, Mekane Yesus, and the Presbyterian Church of East Africa. These are, the Ethiopian Church has more than 10.5 million members. The Presbyterian Church of East Africa has over 4 million members, so these are large national denominations in those countries. And our responsibility is to work with partners, with those church partners in various projects and looking at their priorities. The main thing I wanted to stress about working in partnership, and that's what we do intentionally, is the networking. That is, working with partners in country, the church partners, as well as with ecumenical partners from Scotland and Ireland and some of the mother churches to some of these African partners. and as well working with national councils of churches, Christian health associations within the country, and other networks in each country. We realize that the priorities and the challenges that they have are way too much for us to respond to alone. So there's multiple value in working in partnership. For example, in Western North Carolina Presbyterian partners with Malawi and Guatemala in particular, and the networks that they have, Presbyterian partnerships and so forth, will be the future of world mission, as denominations tend to decentralize or devolve with local partners, churches and presbyteries taking the initiative to work with global partners. That's going to be more and more important. The Presbyterian Church of South Sudan that I'll really focus on today, South Sudan is only 10 years old. They celebrate, it's the newest country in the world. They celebrated 10 years in July. Formerly, of course, they had been together with Sudan, and that created conflict and civil war for many years. Since the 1960s, they've been at war, basically, with a few periods of calm. And they became independent in 2011, and since then, there has been several occasions to have ceasefires and peace agreements that haven't really worked. There's a lot of interethnic tension that is aligned with the political leadership, and unfortunately, there's still some conflict taking place. A lot of it is around land ownership and the use of land for grazing cattle and so forth. So there's a lot of need for prayer in South Sudan for lasting peace. So these are the countries that I primarily work in. Those are the three countries that I was in June and July of this year. Well, this is the shape of South Sudan. It looks fairly small, but it's probably the size of Texas. And the capital is Juba, which you may have heard about in the news. It's way down here in the south. The Presbyterian Church was really born in Malakal, a city in the northern part of South Sudan. This is the Nile River. The main feature, geographic feature really for South Sudan is the Nile. And the work that we do is primarily from this region of eastern part of South Sudan and western Ethiopia. And a lot of the refugees that I work with that I'll talk about in a moment are now in Ethiopia. But this is the area that I went into just recently. South Sudan has about 11 million people, although that number is a guess, because a lot of people are dispersed to displacement camps or to refugee camps. It's very hard to pin down the exact number. In 2017, when I joined Outreach, we had a meeting with the leadership of the Presbyterian Church, and we said, what can we help you with? What are your priorities as a church, as a denomination? And they listed these four things, the top priority being trauma healing, or healing the pain that everyone has experienced because of the displacement and the migration. That's their number one priority. The statement of the moderator at that time was that until we heal these memories and this pain, we'll not be able to live with each other. They harbor those horrific memories that some of you have heard about and know from the news. The second priority is working with young children. Education has been interrupted so many times. The kids have been out of school, and the UN and other NGOs are trying to help as well with primary education. Secondary education is rare, and there's only one university. So for those 11 million people, education is another priority, and is a priority of the church. Literacy is very low. The ability to read scripture, which is one of the few books that's in print, is a concern of the church. And they said Outreach could help them with preschool education, working with very young children, even up into the primary ages. to help them learn to read, to occupy them in a healthy way during the day so that their mothers could be involved in marketing and income generation. The third priority was distributing Bibles, and Bibles in their language, which is a challenge because those Bibles are printed in South Korea, and they have to be shipped through Ethiopia and then trucked to the border and distributed in the refugee camps and in South Sudan. But we've been able to do that on two occasions, in 2017 and again 2 months ago. So it's a thrill to be able to provide Bibles for them. And the fourth thing that they mentioned as a priority is leadership training. Many of their leaders hadn't finished secondary school, much less seminary or evangelism training, and they were trying to run the church. They were trying to run the denomination and nurture the flock. So it was a priority for them as well. Well, just very quickly, this is the part of Ethiopia that juts into South Sudan, and this is where at one point about 500,000 refugees from South Sudan crossed the border and ended up in UN camps in Ethiopia. And many of them are Presbyterian. They come from that region of South Sudan that was evangelized by American Presbyterian missionaries. And so these folks have been a part of the Presbyterian Church of South Sudan, and they were our target as Outreach Foundation. It was an area we could go to. Ethiopia was open to visitation and to work, whereas South Sudan was a bit insecure and risky. So we started working in this region in 2017 on those four priorities: the trauma healing training, education, the Bibles, and leadership training. The round circles are the camps. There are actually 6 of them. And the feature of those camps really is that it's women and children. As you can see from the statistics here, 88% are women and children. The men either perished in the conflict in South Sudan, or they stayed in South Sudan and have joined rebel groups or the government forces and have not gone with their wives. They've been separated from their families. And the women and children are the ones who are the primary occupants of the refugee camps. So many children, about 2/3 are children. So there's a great need for some of these priority things. And many of those children, about 20% of all those children in the camps, came unattended or separated from an adult or from their family. So these are, in a sense, they're orphans who arrived at the border and are in these camps. So there's special needs there for protection, for their rights, and for care. So the trauma healing training with refugees and also with seminary students, you know, the amazing thing about these refugees is their resilience and their faithfulness. They fled horrible conflict basically without anything, excuse me, but their faith. Nobody could take their faith away from them. They crossed the border with their faith, and they exercise that faith regularly, and have started 140 Presbyterian congregations among those camps. They have choirs, they have youth groups, and they actively exercise their faith, which is such an inspiration to me, or to anyone who comes from our culture, for example, to go and see how important and vital faith is to their existence, to their life. So they have also started several seminaries, training schools for evangelists. This is part of the leadership training as well. And we have done trauma healing training with all of those groups. The picture in the top left, for example, is a small group at a congregation where they're going through a trauma healing lesson. And these lessons, the curriculum that we use in trauma healing was designed by the American Bible Society. It's scripture-based, which makes it effective. You know, I have been used to other forms of trauma healing material that's basically psychosocial support by secular organizations, by the UN and other NGOs. But this is faith-based. It's a scripture foundation that makes it so effective. They learn passages of Scripture. They recall those when they're in times of trouble, when a flashback occurs or they have a memory. They know how to deal with it. They know what to call on. And so that curriculum has been really important and has been very effective. And it needs to be done with all refugees globally. So these seminaries take participants. They don't have to necessarily have a secondary diploma, but they have to have a calling. And they go through 3 years of training, and we do trauma healing, several sessions of trauma healing with them. It's a 10-session program, and we do that at least twice so that they have a good foundation of trauma healing and can help others. When they graduated in July of this year, they go back to their community, to their congregations, to South Sudan, and they're all over. In fact, a lot of the participants come from presbyteries in South Sudan, and they go back there. So it's a way to sort of use them as extension officers, if you will. For the education side, it's not only the preschool or early childhood learning program, but it's also adult learning. What we decided to do was to combine preschool education with literacy training for these mothers, mostly, who were illiterate, and so that ultimately they can take a Bible and read it, and can also work with their children as their children go through education. Incredibly important, the preschool program. Kids get ready for school, they get accustomed to what it's like. You can see they don't have resources. We try and provide paper and pens, but they prefer to use the dirt as their Chromebooks. So that's the technology that they use. The Bibles, it was a real joy to be there in June of this year when we distributed 5,000 Bibles in their language to each of those camps. We did it through the Presbyterian, through the congregations. And I also took along reading classes, because the older I get, I realize, some of these folks might want reading classes in order to actually read the Bible. And this woman here was so thrilled to be able to read the Bible. She had learned how to read, but had lost her vision to the point that she really couldn't read. And with the eyeglasses and the new Bible, she was just thrilled. And we were distributing throughout those camps, and it was amazing. It really was a real joy to see the celebration of receiving the Scriptures. Leadership development, as I mentioned, several seminaries, both in camps in Ethiopia and in Kenya. We're also now working with camps in Kenya, because there are Presbyterians that have moved there. As you know, some of the lost boys first went to Ethiopia and then migrated to Kenya, and from Kenya they came to the U.S. So there are about 200,000 refugees in northern Kenya, and it gives them the ability to have leadership training there. The Nile Theological College is in Juba, in the capital of South Sudan, and it is functional. Juba as a city is fairly safe. Of course, it's got a lot of military and police presence, and a lot of expatriates and embassies and the UN are there. So it's a fairly safe place. And there is a major seminary there, the Nile Theological College. These are some of the graduates of the seminary in Ethiopia just in July of this year, and they were thrilled. Outreach also supported Dr. Thomas, who did his obstetric training in Ethiopia. He's a South Sudanese. He did his medical training in Khartoum in the north, but applied to do specialist training. And he realized that South Sudan has the highest maternal mortality rate in the world, and he wanted to use his career to address that and to bring that down. So he went into obstetrics and gynecology, and outreach enabled him to do his training for 4 years, providing funds for that. And he's agreed to go back and work. He just graduated in January of this year, and he's looking for a placement now. We also were involved in COVID. We all know about COVID quite well. There, in much of Africa, there's kind of a time lag between the way COVID looked in the north and in the U.S. There, it was much slower to develop for a variety of reasons. One is that there was very little testing, but certainly vaccine availability is a challenge. The WHO reports that only about 3.5% of Africans have access to the vaccine. So of course there are there's a lot of debate now about the equity of giving a third dose or having a surplus of vaccines in this country, and yet for a pandemic, we need to make sure that our brothers and sisters are also safe. So please consider that and advocate for what's called COVAX, which is a World Health Organization program to help deliver vaccines to the third world, to the developing world. All over Africa, Asia, the Middle East, they're behind us in terms of the availability of vaccines. Outreach was good in providing PPE or protective equipment, as well as food and supplies during the COVID, and also education, trying to make sure people understood that this was a virus, what they could do to protect themselves, and so forth. Well, now we're going to take a trip down the Baro and the Sobat rivers. We're going to go on a minivan to Nasser, which is a town. The first Presbyterian mission station was in the town of Nasser in South Sudan. Dr. Thomas Lambie and other missionaries from the Northern Church, the UPC, arrived there in the early 1900s and set up health care. There was a teacher, and they built a church. And this was a mission station. Those are the three legs of a mission station. And they built a mission station at Nasser here, right on the Sobat River, which runs into the Nile. It's a major tributary of the White Nile. So this river comes down to the border. This red line is the border between Ethiopia and South Sudan. The river comes down and forms the border along here on the Baro River, which further goes up into the mountains of Ethiopia. And the town that we work from is called Gambela. It's the regional capital of that region of Ethiopia. So we're based in Gambela, where we work with the camps in this area of refugees. And we took a minibus to the border here at Jikau, which is where we got on a boat. And this is the journey. 4 hours in the minibus on a pretty bad road, and then 8 hours on the river in a boat like this. It was a challenge. You know, it's a boat that's supposed to have about 8 people. Oh, and I think we had about 15 plus luggage. And you know, I was feeling okay because I was probably the best swimmer on the boat because there were crocodiles in the river. So, when we landed, these ladies these are Presbyterian women. That's their outfit, and they met us at the beach, and they took all our luggage, and they carried it probably a half mile to where we were camped. And this is where we were camped. The first night I stayed in what's called a tukul, a hut like everybody else, but there's no ventilation, there's no air circulating, and it was about 110 degrees. So I decided to set my tent up that I'd taken with me, and I slept in the tent the next couple of nights. It was much better. A little bit noisier, but it was cooler. I was pleased to go with colleagues. This is John McQuatch, who's from San Diego. He is a South Sudanese American. And David Pogwil. John is an elder in the Presbyterian Church. David is a lay pastor in a Presbyterian church in Tennessee, in Gallatin, Tennessee. And they join me on this trip, not only to help with translation and cultural suggestions, but they're representing a large diaspora of South Sudanese who are in America. And this is a pool of people that are in constant contact with their families back home. John got to stay with his brother on this trip along the river. David is building a house there. So they have very close connections with South Sudan. And they also have a colony, if you will, of South Sudanese who were living in America, in San Diego and in Tennessee, in Minneapolis, in Nebraska, a variety of places where refugees end up, or migrants. And so it's a very important part of our ministry, not only on that side, but on this side. And we're realizing the need for trauma healing among that population as well. So it's been very interesting to be with these American South Sudanese as they acculturate to life here. Their children grow up as American kids, so there's some generational challenges there, as you can imagine. But they went with me, and it was a real joy that they were able to help me and to visit their family and friends back home. Well, we got to meet the county commissioner. He's basically like a governor for that whole region. And he had been assigned just a few months earlier by the government to Nasser to help redevelop, to rebuild Nasser, where our project is to rebuild hope in South Sudan. So it matched perfectly. This was an old mission station. It was sort of the center of a lot of Presbyterians in that region. So we had a wonderful time meeting and talking about what could be done for tree planting, for a water project, for rebuilding the church, for so many areas that needed development. The picture in the top right is Nasser town. That's the way it looks now. At one point, it was before the war, before the Civil War, it was a city. It was a town. There were 250,000 people in that area. So this is what has to be redeveloped, if you will. And the bottom picture is First Presbyterian Church. And that's the pastor. He has another place to preach now under a tree. But that church was the first of the Presbyterian churches on that mission station that was built. And that was the first hospital, the Nasser Presbyterian Hospital, where Dr. Lambie practiced and handed over to another missionary doctor who carried on until they were chased out of South Sudan, out of Sudan at that time, and crossed over into Ethiopia. But the hospital is destroyed. The iron sheets, the roofing have been turned into homes and shops. But we were pleased to meet with a lot of Presbyterians. And the picture in the bottom right is the leadership from two presbyteries from that area. And they were so excited to greet us and to learn that we were interested in a major project, and that is finishing the church. This church was constructed in 2012 and 2013. And then when the war broke out in December of 2013, it stopped. And that's the way it's looked ever since. Now, Outreach raised over $100,000 for this church, and they bought supplies that were unfortunately looted. Cement and iron framework and sheets and so forth. Those things were all stolen. So this is what the church looks like today. And a big part of my mission in July was to go visit the church, assess what its condition is, and talk to the builders. And I found the builders who were building this church and the engineer, and asked what it would take to complete this job. It's a big church. It's a very big church. It will be the biggest church of the Presbyterian Church of South Sudan. And it will be a place where all of these Presbyterians, the two presbyteries and all of their members will worship together. So they're excited to see if we can help them to complete this task and to have a magnificent place for them to worship and to hold other events as well. So this was the primary purpose of my going to Nasser, was to see the condition of that church. Jeff Ritchie, who was my predecessor at Outreach Foundation, had visited 2 times before the war and had raised the money for building this church. Well, unfortunately, a lot of that money was gone. The bank that they were banking in South Sudan was also destroyed, and that money was gone. But the local people had raised $60,000 US, which is almost hard to believe. Back before the war, in 2012 and 2013, they were contributing towards this church, and they want to contribute again from whatever they have. They're willing to do the labor, so they're starting to collect sand, they're starting to mold bricks, they're starting to collect water that can be used. Those things won't be stolen. They're not valuable for looting. But our task then in the second phase of completing this is raising funds for the cement and the other materials that will complete the church. We'll have to get those in Ethiopia and try and get them up the river or up a bad road to Nasser. So that's the appeal that I'm trying to put together now through outreach to try and raise funds. I've got an estimate of $185,000 needed by the engineer to complete this church, and so that they can start worshiping there again. Excuse me. So these are some of the faces I see every time I go. They're doctors, there's a seminary professor, there's a relief and development worker, there's seminary students, they're Presbyterian women, but they're mostly children. And that's what I see every time I go, just swarms of children, which is a real joy because they're typically happy in barefoot and rags, but they're playing soccer as they can, and they're happy to sing for you. It's just a joy to be around people who are joyful and worshipful. So that is, I don't know what our timing is. Yeah, that's a bit about what outreach is doing in East Africa, in particular in South Sudan. Really didn't have time to go into Kenya or Ethiopia, but they're also involved in working with troubled children and vulnerable children in Kenya, children on the streets with our Presbyterian Church of East Africa. In Ethiopia, working with a university fellowship of one of the universities there to work with young people. So this is just an example of the kinds of programs that the Outreach Foundation is involved in. Now, the Outreach Foundation, many of you may remember, was part of the Presbyterian Church, was one of the validated agencies back until the late 90s, early 2000s, together with the Medical Benevolence Foundation and Presbyterian Frontier Fellowship. Well, those three organizations have broken away from the denomination from World Mission and have continued to do wonderful work in their three areas. Medical Benevolence Foundation, of course, in the area of medical training and working with partner hospitals, and Frontier Fellowship, Frontier Fellowship is working primarily in evangelism and working in the predominantly Muslim world. So we are Presbyterian. Outreach Foundation is Presbyterian. We work with the Evangelical Presbyterian Church as well as the PCUSA, as well as ECO, at congregational level, at Presbyterian level, and at denominational level where we can. And so it's a pleasure for me to continue my work with Presbyterians and with the church that I love. As for the future, there is a trend among major denominations to downsize or be downsized and to decentralize a lot of their work. The PCUSA has just done a consultancy looking at restructuring of the Presbyterian Mission Agency, which is focused primarily on what's happening nationally in the U.S. And how the Presbyterian Mission Agency will work with middle bodies and congregations and communities to continue their ministry. There's less clarity about what that means for world mission, which is very different. But there are fewer and fewer missionaries today than there ever have been. And a lot of that is being picked up by Presbyterian support, by the Outreach Foundation, by a group called the Antioch Partners, which is also a sending agency that works closely with the Outreach Foundation and other Presbyterian denominations. So it'll be interesting to see how all of this works. But our partners are eager. They don't care if you're a Presbyterian from EPC or PCUSA, as long as you align with their theological beliefs and policies of their church, and we work under them. Obviously, when we go to Malawi as missionaries, we work with the Presbyterian Church there, the CCAP, and we work alongside them under their policies and with their beliefs. So it's going to be interesting to see how missions evolves in the future. It certainly changed tremendously since 1979 when I first went under the PCUS that became the PCUSA. We went out as some of the last career missionaries. Then they switched to term missionaries, and the terms were 4 years, they became 3 years, and there was a lot of flexibility on how long people went or where they went, how they were supported. And in recent years, it's been required that they raise most of their money before they can go. And it's been very difficult. It's not only based on the amount of resources, but it's the structure of world mission itself that has changed tremendously during my time with the Presbyterian Church. The staff of world mission have turned over a number of times, and so it's difficult for people in the field and for our partners to know exactly who they're communicating with or who they're dealing with. But it's God's work, and that He's our boss, and that's who we work for. Whether we, under which flag, it doesn't really matter. But we know that He's in charge, and that keeps us going. So I hope I've left ample time for questions. I can probably turn the lights over. Somebody was asking about a family update. Since I came back in July, we've added 2 grandkids to our family, and Polly has added a great granddaughter and grandson to her list of grandchildren and great grands. Our son Moses, who some of you know, was a counselor in clubs here and married Leonette, and they have their first daughter, so their first child, and he's thrilled at age 33 to now be a father, and he's doing a wonderful job. Our daughter Jessie and Saul, her husband, they are missionaries with the EPC, with World Outreach. Jessie was also a counselor here and worked at the conference center for a while. They both love Montreat, certainly, as well. And Jessie added their son Sidon to their other 4 kids who are all under 6 years of age. So you can imagine she's kind of busy these days. But they live in Illinois, and they visit this area from time to time because of their EPC and World Outreach work. I think that covers most everything that I was going to say. So thank you, Chalodatesh in Nuer, in the language there from South Sudan, or Asante Sana in Kenya. And I'm happy to answer whatever questions, areas that I've left out or need clarifying. Yes, ma'am.
Is the larger part of Sudan Muslim and the southern part Christian, or is it a division Muslim Christian?
You're right. Actually, the northern part is mostly Arab and Muslim, predominantly more like 85% Muslim. The south is about 2/3 Christian and mostly Black African. So they're pretty distinct differences between the north and the south. The challenge at the time of the split is that their major resource is oil, and that's in the middle. So a lot of the fighting was over where you draw the line, who gets the resource, as you can imagine. So South Sudan is a landlocked country now, no access to the sea, which presents a lot of challenges with its neighbors, and with access to goods and services. But you're right, the north is mostly Arab Muslim, and the south Black African Christian.
Where is Khartoum?
Khartoum, let's see if I can go back to this slide. Where is it? Khartoum is, so this is the northern part. Sudan was the largest country in Africa before the split. Khartoum is about here. So the Nile, of course, comes down and through Khartoum, it winds its way through South Sudan, goes through Juba, the capital of South Sudan. So there is potential for a river, for the use of the Nile to move goods and services that way. But the border has just recently really reopened between Sudan and South Sudan. So it facilitates that now.
So Khartoum is in northern Sudan.
Khartoum is a northern, it was the capital of Sudan, and now is the capital of the northern part of Sudan. Big city, the largest city in all of Sudan. The capital city of the South, Juba, has about 250,000 people.
Well, aren't there Presbyterians in Khartoum also?
There are some in Khartoum. Many of them migrated back to the south, and they came with what's called the South Sudan Evangelical Presbyterian Church, SPEC. And they are working together in the seminaries. They're jointly trained in the seminaries, and the professors are from both sides. The SPEC church is a small church, primarily those who came from the north. There is a campus of Nile Theological College in Khartoum that was started by Bill Anderson, the late Bill Anderson, and then the Juba campus was developed and is a much bigger program. Anyone else? Jim, it's nice to see you. I'm thrilled, I'm honored to be in the room with saints. You know, there's so many people here who have given their life to the church and to mission, and understand what mission is, and certainly what it was in those good old days, if you will. And like everything else, there's change taking place, and I think they'll, you know, as long as we stay focused and we know where to put our faith, we'll be okay. And like I say, one of the most inspiring things for me is to be among refugees who have fled, horrific situations, been separated from their loved ones and family, and yet they are joyful in that they know whose they are. They know that they can bring their faith with them and exercise their faith, and nobody can take that away from them. They still endure some difficulties getting their food rations from World Food Program, which have been reduced, or health care through the UN or through non-government organizations. They face lots of difficulties. Their kids may not be in school, as many of them are not. But you know where to find them on Sunday and Wednesday and Tuesday and Thursday usually, and almost any day. And when I go through these camps that are, many of them are tent camps, as you've seen in pictures on television, or rows and rows of simple huts, one-room huts, you can hear singing. And you can see people under a tree doing a Bible study. And so that's an inspiration to me. Yes?
If a young missionary went out, what might they be asked to do?
Almost anything. And that's another change I've seen in mission over the last 40 years. In the early mission stations, it was a doctor, a nurse, a teacher, or a pastor evangelist, and maybe one or two builders. That kind of thing would be the vocations or the occupations of most of the mission workers. We've had missionaries who are real estate agents, who are accountants and architects, anybody who feels called to go and serve can be put to work. And it's amazing, the kind of work that people have taken on with very little professional training, but work alongside someone and together they can do amazing things. A lot of it's construction kind of work, or it could be office work, bookkeeping, accounting, and certainly preaching and evangelism. So a young person needs to be prepared to probably take a tent and a good pair of tennis shoes and do anything.
Would they be asked to learn the newer language?
This is another thing that's changed, of course, over the years from when I went out, and there were long-term missionaries, and that was the focus. My grandparents were missionaries in China, and they took a ship and went to China and basically said goodbye. And the idea was they were not going to come back in 3 years or 4 years necessarily. Now with the way the world has shrunk and the way people expect to not be too far away from their family or their friends, missionaries are more short-term, 2 or 3 years at the most, and the whole phenomenon of short-term mission has grown since the late 90s, and you're familiar with that. Churches and presbyteries and other groups that go out for a week or 2 weeks. And, they can do amazing things, and they can certainly learn about the other culture and the other church, but what is not developed is a relationship. And that's what mission's all about. It's about developing not just a friendship, but and not just a partnership. I really don't like the term partnership, because that could be like a legal term or an office term. But it's really becoming family. It's really developing a deep relationship. And that includes learning the language. And that's a real challenge in some places. A newer language is tough. It's not a Bantu language, which I was used to from Central and Southern Africa. It's a mix of Arabic and Amharic and other language pieces, because it's much further north. It's above the equator. So the older I get, the harder it is to learn a language. But it is important, and that's one reason why we need younger people. We need youth. And, the Presbyterian Church is also changing if you look at the last 4 years. So we need to encourage young people to consider missions, to consider that as a calling, to exercise and demonstrate their faith as a career in mission. Because the mission field is still looking for people. Our partners are still needing people to come and mentor local people, to help with training. And that's the best investment we can make, is leadership training and development, working with people rather than simply building buildings. It will be nice to have this church completed. It will be a tangible way to rebuild hope in South Sudan. But, equally important is training, making sure that there are evangelists who can go out from that church, who can be in the community and work, outside of that church. So there are needs all around. Other questions?
Talk a little bit about how the South Sudanese in the United States, like in Tennessee and those other places, how you work with them to help their families and their...
Well, some of you are familiar with the Lost Boys, from the 90s, those who have heard amazing stories of fleeing conflict. Many of them went to these camps, these same camps, Penudo in Ethiopia, and then migrated to Kenya, to Kakuma, which may be a more familiar camp name, from which the UN helped to resettle them. Many of them came to the U.S. with just a bag that said IOM on it, which is the International Agency for Migration of the UN. And they were sent through Catholic Charities or the Jesuit Brothers or through other church groups primarily to Skaneateles, New York, or to Minneapolis, or to St. Paul's, Minnesota. And they were right off the plane. They'd never been on an airplane before. And if you can imagine, everything is new. And some of the stories and some of the documentaries or movies. A Good Lie is one of those movies. Talked about these guys from South Sudan who come in and are taken by a social worker to an apartment complex, which is, they're on the second story, and there's no second story in South Sudan. And they're shown the light switch. All you have to do is move that, and instantly you've got light. You can drink from the tap. There's tap water. There was a telephone that rings, and they didn't know what to do with it. So there are tremendous adjustments that take place with any migrant or refugee that ends up here. These lost boys drifted to where there were other South Sudanese. As you can imagine, that's what they may have a relative even in the States, or they know someone who's in Tennessee, for example, in Gallatin, Tennessee, or in Clarkston, Georgia. And so they tend to cluster in that way. They establish their own churches, and there are South Sudanese American Church, Presbyterian Church in Gallatin, Tennessee, and David is the lay pastor there. And they're probably 70 or 80 members who are all South Sudanese. They worship in Nuer. But they also have English because their kids only speak English. Their kids who are growing up in the U.S. Want to fit in with American kids. They don't want to be seen as different, so they are less likely to hold on to any cultural values or language that they would have brought with them from Africa. And that has created some need for some trauma healing work. We've done some intergenerational trauma healing among refugee or migrants and diaspora, because there's conflict between their kids who are growing up rapidly as American kids and the parents who have come from this situation in Africa. They are also being trained. A lot of these folks who came as lost boys are now doctors and lawyers, and they have access to education that they never would have had, of course, where they were. And so that we're working with them. And I was on a Zoom call with a group of doctors, South Sudanese doctors, one in Minneapolis and one in Seattle, who were asking me about my trip. Because the other thing I did while I was in Nasser was visit the hospital, not only that mission hospital that's been destroyed, but a government hospital nearby that was also attacked and is not really functional. But the idea was to rebuild Nasser Mission Station, the school and the hospital, in addition to the church. So that's what we're aiming for, and these doctors were willing to take on the health side of that. So they are forming a nonprofit or a non-government organization registered in South Sudan to work on the health part of Nasser. So there's a lot of interest among the diaspora and even support. They pay their own way. These guys bought their own tickets and paid for their accommodation and food and so forth. So it's an opportunity right here, even in the Shenandoah Valley and where migrants are coming. There likely be an Afghanistan family in this area, perhaps. Charlotte, there are over 5,000 Congolese in Charlotte. There are over 12,000 South Sudanese in Omaha, Nebraska. So they tend to go where their family and friends are, and they need to be integrated. I mean, we need to work with them and encourage them, and in much the same way as we would if we were in South Sudan. So there are opportunities there, and I hope you'll keep your eyes open and ears open for that, even around here. Yes?
Frank, in addition to COVID, which is worldwide, what are the other main medical problems that you're facing in Sudan?
Thank you, Olson. I'm glad to see you. It was hard to recognize you. Absolutely. Most of them are preventable diseases. As you can imagine, there's a lot of malnutrition, particularly among children, a lot of severe acute malnutrition. There are respiratory diseases that would be very common among children and adults. There are tropical diseases, certainly because the seasons here are wet and dry, basically, and hot all the time. There's a lot of malaria, a lot of other tropical diseases that they deal with. And access to medication is very limited, very scarce. So these doctors that I was talking with want to set up a rural health program and provide basic preventive and primary health care to address some of those basic issues. People have, of course, migrated if they had gunshot wounds and other trauma, clinical trauma that way. But so much of it is children. And I'll sign you up to go with me next year because they need you. And it's the children have been traumatized too. And what I was trained to do in trauma healing through the Bible Society was work with children. And it's really special to what we learned in November of 2017. We did a trauma healing for children. And we realized that we, of course, had to work with adults first because it's the adults who work with the children primarily. And those adults have been traumatized. And so we had to back up a step and do trauma healing among the adults and then work with the children once they had understood the trauma healing program and could work with the children. But children act in and act out and show all the primary symptoms of trauma, as you can imagine, from the memories that they have and from their parents, secondary trauma. So there's great need in terms of mental health, and I'm glad that at least mental health is becoming known here in this country and addressed, as it certainly should be and should have been. But it's been neglected globally, and we see some consequences. Another thing that I should point out is that everybody over there has a gun. All of South Sudan has been infiltrated with a lot of weapons from the Soviet Union and from America. There are AK-47s and there are grenades and there's IEDs and things that are readily available. And our boat driver had to have an AK-47 when we went up on the river. And that it seems to be part of his outfit, part of the norm, which is really a tragedy. But and they have talked about recovering all of the weapons and trying to de-escalate the military side of things, but it's very difficult because there's a lot of conflict still over land rights and grazing of the animals and farming. So. Well, I hope this has provided some context of what some else of what the Outreach Foundation is involved in, at least in Africa. Looks similar in many respects to the Middle East in terms of the trauma work, but totally different context, and a heavy history of Presbyterianism in that region. And I consider Nasser to be similar to Montreat in many respects, that it's a hub of a lot of Presbyterian work and life. And so we would like to help them rebuild hope in South Sudan, and both tangible and intangible ways. So thank you. I'm willing to stay around. I was told I had 3 hours, but it's right at 6, so I guess.
Great, thanks a bunch.